I recently signed up for, trained for, and competed in my first ever Hyrox event in Melbourne, Australia. And in this video, I'm going to tell you a bit about how I trained for my first ever Hyrox. If you're looking to do your first Hyrox event, or you're looking for some ideas for your own training, this video will be really helpful. Let's jump straight into it. So first of all, what is Hyrox? Hyrox is largely an endurance event. It involves running intervals of 1,000 meters, followed by exercises such as sled pull, sled push, burpee broad jumps, rowing, and ski erg, as well as more. These events are the same no matter where in the world you do them. The movements are the same, and the weights and the distances are all the same. This means that if you are traveling, or you're moving interstate or moving overseas, and you want to do these, it's going to be the same no matter where you run your race. So why did I choose to do a Hyrox event? Training for a Hyrox event was completely opposite to the type of training that I've previously been doing for a number of years. I've typically been focused on strength training for the sport of strongman. There hasn't really been a significant cardiovascular component to my training, but I actually felt that that was lacking. So I saw it as a good opportunity to push myself outside of my comfort zone and to do something a little bit different. One of the places that I do some coaching at was also putting a team together of people to do their first ever event. So it was a great chance to train alongside many of the people who do my classes and to do the event with them. What was the focus of my training for this event? I really looked to train my biggest weakness. Now, the biggest weakness by far was my running. It was a real struggle for me, so my attention was around building that up in the most sustainable way possible. When I would run previously, I would get really bad shin splints and calf pain, and it was just not a fun experience. However, knowing that this time around, that was something I knew I needed to work on. Plus, building up my cardiovascular endurance was the biggest factor of how the event would go for me. The average finish time for a Hyrox event is around 90 minutes. So being comfortable working at a high heart rate for that long is actually paramount. This meant doing a lot of cardio only sessions that were longer in duration, so 60 to 90 minutes, and doing these a few times per week. So doing these sessions at a moderate intensity helps you build that foundation, that base that you then need to complete the event. And I was keeping these sessions at a zone 2 heart rate, meaning they weren't really intense, they weren't really taxing, but they were giving me the results that I needed to actually be able to get fitter and to last the distance. I began training for this event about 3 months out. So one of the things that I found really helpful was to break my training down into blocks. In the first block, I had a 70-30 split. In the second block was a 60-40, and the last block was a 50-50 split. As I got closer to the event, my training began to replicate the events more so with things like the right distances, the right weights, and the right conditions. So doing some running before doing those events to replicate as closely as I could what it would be like on the day. So the way the blocks work, in the first month, I was spending 70% of my time working on my weaker areas. So for me, that was the cardiovascular endurance. The other 30% was spent working on more strength elements, things like the sled push, sled pull, and my regular strength sessions. In the second month, it became 60-40. So I'd spend about 60% of my time on the cardiovascular endurance and 40% of my time on more of the strength elements there. And then the final month was about 50-50. So half the time was spent endurance, the other half was spent doing run-throughs of the events and just replicating as close to. And if you're wanting to apply this to your own training, you can do this simply by looking at how many hours per week do you train, adding it up from Monday through Sunday, how many hours realistically can you get in per week? And then what you would do is just break that down accordingly. So you would take 70%, focus on those weaker areas, and 30% working on stuff that you know is in your wheelhouse. It's something that's pretty good for you and you don't really have much trouble with it. That way, when you do it this way, it doesn't have to feel like you're doing a whole bunch of extra sessions and you're spending hours and hours doing all of this stuff. You're just allocating your time onto the things that you need to work on that are specific to you. And everyone will be different. Some people might be used to running a lot, and this is going to be quite easy for them. 8 kilometers of running might seem like a really small amount to you. So therefore, your time might be better off spent working on the strength stuff. And vice versa, if you're like me, and you've spent a lot of time working on your strength, then you need to shift the focus again. If you're in the same boat as me and you typically do more strength training than you do cardiovascular work, or you're fairly new to exercise and you're wanting to get into this as a first step, going about it by building up slowly is a very good idea. Give yourself time to acclimatize to the endurance work, especially the running if you're not used to it. This will help you avoid many of the injuries that are associated with trying to go from 0 to 100 straight away, which a lot of people do, and then they find they get running related injuries that creep up because their body isn't actually used to the volume that they're trying to do. So the week overview kind of looked like this. In the lead up, I was usually training about 6 days per week. This was a mix of weight training sessions with a little bit of cardio, solely cardio sessions, and then also some solely weight sessions. So they were constantly mixed up. I kept it at about 3 weight sessions. So these were pure weight sessions, 1 of a mixed session, and the rest were made up of solely cardiovascular work. Some of the days I would do my weights in the morning, and then later in the afternoon or towards the evening, I would go for a run or do a ride. So majority of the time was spent working on building my aerobic base, and I used 2 major things here. So I was running, and I also used the bike to do cycle classes and cycle sessions. This was really good because it helped me avoid any of the running related injuries because I wasn't used to running that amount in the beginning, but it still allowed me to build up the work that I needed to actually make the adaptations and the changes. So one of the things that I mentioned before was if you jump into the running volume straight away and you're not really used to it, you can lead yourself down the road of getting niggles, which then turn into injuries, and it's not a fun time. So that's where having a different modality, something like bike, or it could be rowing or swimming, whatever, that's something that's not as load bearing, is a really good option. It still allows you to make those changes internally that then fuel you to go the distance. So doing it this way allowed me to do about 2 to 3 run sessions per week, and these were only about 2 to 3 kilometers at most in the beginning. As I built up the tolerance to running and I was pulling up less and less sore, I began to increase the amount that I was doing. And I would sub out the work that I was doing on the bike with more of the running to replicate what I was needing to do in the event, which was to run. So what sort of strength training was I doing to prepare for this event? To be honest, I was still doing many of my original sessions, which were based around the 4 big lifts, which was squat, bench, deadlift, and overhead press. I would simply build up to a max for the day on whatever movement it was, and then do some back off sets at a lower percentage. I was also combining some of this work with some of the movements that were coming up in the event. So for example, things like burpee broad jumps, farmer's walks, wall balls, rowing, etc. One of the things that I've been using for a number of years is giant sets. I use this in all of my training at the moment, and it's been really effective. When I was training for this event, all I was doing was subbing in some of the movements that are in the event, in the Hyrox event, into my giant sets. So that way I was getting in some specific work of things that were coming up, as well as my normal strength work. One of the things that I did extensively was running strengthening exercises. So previously when I would run, I would get really sore in the lower legs. So that meant that I needed to actually strengthen up these muscles. So these are your calf muscles, the muscles of the ankles, and the shins as well. If those muscles aren't strong, that then leaves you open and vulnerable to getting more and more injuries. So I was doing a lot of like calf raises with both straight knees and bent knees, holds in both positions as well, and then some simple jumps up and down on the spot to help build the tendons, build the strength, and build that tolerance to running. The event day went really, really well, and I did feel prepared going into it. So we had to run a circuit a number of times to get the 1,000 meters before heading into the middle to do one of the 8 exercises and then heading out for another run. I will say this, it is definitely a hard event. It is by no means an easy thing to do. Towards the end of the event, I did notice that the fatigue was really catching up with me. Finishing the event, I was completely exhausted, but I managed to finish 11 minutes faster than I did in my previous training session. So after the event, what would I do differently if I was training for it again? I would first and foremost allocate more time into improving my running and just building up the capacity for that. Although I could run consistently and I could complete the event without having to stop, I didn't feel like I could push any faster. I was just feeling like I was able to get through the event. Also, towards the end of the event, the running was eventually catching up with me and really causing some fatigue. So I tried to make that a bit more of a strong point. That's not to say that the training I had done didn't necessarily work. It's just a reflection looking at if I was to do this again, I would definitely spend just a little bit more time working on the running, those calf strengthening exercises, and so forth. As for the movements in between, I actually feel like the training I normally do prepares me really well for those. So that's regular training with barbells and dumbbells, and also strongman training. That seemed to give me a really good base, and none of the events really proved to be very difficult at all. They were just taxing and fatiguing, but nothing I couldn't complete. So I feel like the training I do would be enough to keep me going quite well with those events, and I would spend more of that time on the cardiovascular endurance work. So hopefully this has given you some ideas about how to potentially prepare for an event like Hyrox if you're considering doing one. I'll be doing some more content around things like nutrition and some other hybrid training videos talking about how I actually do this type of training on a regular basis. So stay tuned for that. Try out some of the things for yourself if you are preparing for a Hyrox. Try breaking the training up into those blocks. Implement some of those exercises I spoke about in this video, and I'm sure you're going to do really, really well. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.